Okay, welcome to the Socratic Club. We are going through the book by the Sri Lankan theologian, Gods That Fail, by Vinod Ramachandra. And the subtitle says Modern Idolatry and Christian Mission. So this is telling that what are some of the modern idols, and it also telling about how Christians, as part of the Christian mission, have propagated idolatry. And so, how we need to break those idols. We are in chapter 5, the violence of idols. And then let me quote the introductory quotation from Emil Brunner, from Emil Brunner's book, Man in Revolt. For every civilization, for every period of history, it is true to say, show me what kind of gods you have, and I will tell you what kind of humanity you possess. So, to this evening, the facilitator is, Ellie. She will summarize, part of the chapter, and then if we have time, we'll discuss it. Okay.
So maybe I'll just go back a bit to what we talked about a couple of weeks back. How, the chapter is about violence of idols and how we see violence in a lot of things. It seems to be very pervasive, but at the same time subtle. It's not something really fully realized. Like, for example, Ramachandra was talking about how idolatry causes, in a way, causes violence to us because idolatry dehumanizes us. That whenever we would worship God as our creator, it enhances our humanity because He's the giver of our life. But if we sometimes forget that our created things, we elevate them and treat them as something that we would worship. In that sense, it diminishes our humanity. And he even makes a quotation on Psalm 115, verses 4 to 8.
Yes.
He says their idols are silver and gold, made by the hands of men. They have mouths, but they cannot speak, eyes, but they cannot see. They have ears, but cannot hear, noses, but they cannot smell. They have hands, but they cannot feel, feet, but they cannot walk. Nor can they utter a sound with their throats. And then last two lines would be, those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. And he says that the shattering conclusion of the psalm is that we become like what we worship. So it, dehumanizes us. Idolatry tends to do that. So in a sense, there is violence in that. And he was also talking about how development has become an ideology for us. I think was it Karl Marx, talking about ideology, he was talking about this superstructure. It was a set of dominant ideas that were in a group of people or in a culture or a society. In another chapter, he also said that it was Marx who said that there was a corruption of reason by class interests, and that's what he called the ideology. Sometimes the real interests of the rulers are being concealed to propagate a certain hidden agenda.
Yeah, he actually defines ideology as theoretical reason corrupted by self-interest. Wow, yeah, theoretical reason, how a reason gets corrupted by, self-interest. That's his definition of, ideology. Yeah, continue.
Now, in this day and age, development has become an ideology for us. And we've talked about how we have we're making use of several indices, their index to measure development, but it's hardly very accurate. For example, we have the GNP, the GDP. It talks about the amount of capital resources that the country has, but it doesn't really talk about the distribution or the quality of it. So, we've somehow created this ideology out of development that this is what it means to be developed. This is what it means to be like this. And in a way, Ramachandra was saying that this kind of ideology has developed in us an acquisitive instinct and has become the breeding ground for competitiveness, greed, and violence. So he's also talking about development as an ideology, bringing forth violence among us without us actually really realizing it. So yeah. Now, talking about these violence, Ramachandra makes a reference to two biblical accounts. So the first one is in Genesis 6 to 9, so the Noah and the flood, if you remember. So he discusses these two accounts. Well, the other one is Noah and the flood, and the next one is the Tower of Babel. So he discusses these two accounts, talking about the violence that was in there and how God responded to that violence. So, yeah, the first one is in Genesis chapter 6 to 9. So he says that by this time there seems to be the story is set against the spreading moral chaos in human life. So it seems that come chapter 6 there seems to be this kumbaga the ultimate moral chaos is present. He doesn't really discuss it, but if we look back from chapter 3, during the time of the fall, that's when sin started to creep into humanity and the creation. So, and then come chapter 4, I think, we see how Cain
And Abel, yeah.
and Abel, how Cain murdered Abel, and when God was looking for Abel, he said, Cain, where is your brother? And then he says, seemingly in a very sarcastic way, am I my brother's keeper? So it seems that in a way sin has intensified. You could say that in contrast to Genesis chapter, during the time of Adam and Eve, remember when they sinned and God was looking for them, and then they said that they hid because they were afraid. They heard that God was coming. But here when God was looking for Abel from Cain, he blatantly says that it's as if the fear is no longer there. He blatantly says that, am I my brother's keeper? And then in I think the same chapter also, the account of Lamech, wherein he tells his two wives, I think he was saying, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 70
times.
So it was as if he was boasting about it. So it seems like we see the progression of sin, how it subtly has become, it's subtly being intensified. And come chapter 6, it seems that the narrator is no longer speaking in stories. The narrator is already saying that the earth has become corrupt. He says there that the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thought of his heart was only evil continually. So, and we start to see some contrast. In Genesis chapter 1, it says there, God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. But come chapter 6 and verses 11 and 12, it says there, the earth was corrupt in God's sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. So what was once very good has now become corrupted and filled with violence. So Ramachandra also says that at this point, during the time of Noah, sin has become a reversal of the creation order. Okay? We could say that in Genesis chapter 1 verse 9, it says there, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear, when God was creating the world. But during the flood, it's as if the waters came from heaven, filled all of the earth until every dry land disappeared. So there's a bit of a reversal there. And he also says that the flood, what happened was that the flood is not the vengeful act of a capricious God, as opposed to, I guess, perhaps the ancient Near Eastern parallels where they have gods who would do things out of a whim or very fickle-minded, But with God, it wasn't the same with him. Ramachandra is saying that the flood is not the vengeful act of a capricious God. It is a picture of what happens when human beings abdicate their God-given responsibility for each other and for the earth. So the flood is what happens, is a picture of what happens when we refuse or we relinquish the responsibility that God gave us to take care of the earth. Yeah, so it seems that we see a picture of the flood even today in the way that we've talked about how we've regarded development as an ideology, how we would treat the earth now. It seems like we have created the flood story. We have recreated it. We just really don't realize it. We just really don't know it. And moving on, he says that there's another thread that runs the story. So definitely the flood, we could say that God allowed it for the human beings to experience, or the consequence of what they did. But we can see that God's judgment is still coupled with God's mercy and God's grace. So he says that there's another thread that runs through the story, and that is God's gracious and intimate concern for his own. So we read that the sight of human wickedness and the corruption of the earth through violence grieved him to his heart, it says in chapter 6, verse 6. And these words convey both anger and anguish. The fact that this is figurative language should not blind us to the truth that God suffers in the face of what we do with ourselves and with the non-human creation. So he says that God himself feels the pain of a twisted world. So I just find that amazing how God would be with us, not just in our suffering, but he would also feel the pain whenever we would distort ourselves, we would distort creation. So he feels that as well. And he says that the wrath of God is actually the other side of his loving involvement with us. The opposite of love is not wrath, but indifference. And to ask God to be indifferent to sin is to ask him to cease to love. So we see, Ramachandra is saying that we see that God's wrath is actually part of his love. Like, we cannot see God's love apart from wrath, but maybe his part is actually a part of his love for us. So we see that despite humanity's sin, God still did not let humanity go. So even if he sent the floods and the flood eradicated humankind and all of creation, he spared one family. So out of that sinful humanity, his grace finds Noah. So while the story of the flood speaks of chaos and divine judgment, the story of Noah is the story of God's gracious love and Noah's response to faithful obedience to that love. So he's saying that the waters of judgment are also the means of preservation. It was also his means to preserve and let the creation continue. Yeah. And then he quotes, or he makes a reference to Richard Bauckham. I think I looked him up, and he's a theological scholar. And he says that, talking about the nuclear holocaust, how utilizing nuclear weapons has this threat of eradicating all of creation, all of humankind. And he says that they threaten to destroy the creation, which God himself, despite his grief over its despoliation by human sin, has pledged himself to preserve. So it seems that the use of nuclear weapons would only be one of them, but it seems that human beings, we have a way of seizing this godlike power to destroy God's creation. It's ironic because God himself has pledged no longer to destroy his creation, and yet here we are, wanting to destroy it ourselves, seizing that godlike power. So it's as if in our own ways, we're trying to be gods in our own right, trying to destroy the creation of God. which in the first place he himself pledged to preserve. And